Okay, so yeah, welcome to our first open session of the year around safety and inclusion across the SIG-Chi family of conferences. To rapidly cover our community norms for this session, which will be posted long form as a link in the chat. You can add pronouns to your username by right-clicking the box containing your face in the Zoom window and selecting rename. When speaking, we ask that you state your name, pronouns, and institution. This is not required, but it's encouraged. Any participation, questions, comments, which includes content posted to the chat or collaborative document, is going to be recorded for accessibility and transparency's sake. So as such, your consent is ongoing. We'll post the session in full with additional accessibility options on the SIG-Chi YouTube channel. And then if posting after the event, hashtag SIG-Chi or hashtag Open Talks are your hashtag choice. So yeah, as always, our time together serves to highlight the incredibly complicated interactions between individual experiences and systemic policies and operations. These are sources of ongoing frustration, violence, and oppression for many. And as with anyone's personal experiences, that frustration is valid. There will be no questioning of firsthand experiences permitted in this space. We're an internationally diverse group of humans, and we should keep that in mind. Not everyone comes here with the same education level or cultural access to social justice or matters of identity. There's going to be times when identifying words, phrases, or understandings are insensitive or hurtful. If these moments come up, take each other in good faith, offer a quick correction, and then just refocus on the topic of the moment. So be patient. Just show sensitivity to anyone who has the floor. Keep aware of how much time and space you're taking up, and that others may need a moment of silence to collect themselves before speaking. Be critical, but constructively so. Be kind, be supportive, be hard on systems and soft on people. We have live chat and live captions. In the event of harassment, discrimination, or additional needs by another attendee or by a presenter, please directly message an organizer. So that could be myself, that could be Neha, and our other members of the equity community who are with us today, Elena, Daniel, and Kaylee. We'll be covering a range of potentially triggering or upsetting topics as this session is about safety and harm writ large at our conferences, so let's be sensitive to what that might evoke. Any mention of assault, discrimination, oppression, substance use, or harm will only be mentioned with the intention of preventing them at our events. So as this session centers those often marginalized and silenced voices, please allow space in discussion for those with less privilege to be able to speak first. So we have a collaborative doc, which we will post to the chat, as well as a Slido for posting and uploading questions as a secondary way to engage. And I guess with that, we can kind of formally start. So yeah, as many of you know, I'm Cale Passmore, pronouns they, them, he, or really any. I'm your SIG-Chi Equity Chair, an interdisciplinary knowledge worker and impact analyst for the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies. And I'm speaking from Saskatoon, Canada, on Treaty 6 land, unceded homeland of the Métis and many other First Nations peoples, from the Saulteaux to the Plains to the Woods, Cree, Dene, Nakota, Lakota, Dakota. And as a white settler benefiting from the violence of ongoing colonialism, the fact that I'm speaking here today carries a tension. That's a tension between whose voices are heard and granted power to set norms and policies, and whose voices are most affected by those norms. And that's actually why you're here today. So the safety plan that we've kind of come up with to date is a response to a demand across our community, across years, for improved safety. The basis for the documents that we'll be going over began from experiences collected across the equity talks over the last year and a half, from interviews with chairs, from activist groups, grassroots groups, different HCI organizations, and from past reports. I need to stress a couple things about what I'm about to show you. And the first of that is that these works are not meant to be comprehensive or complete. They're living documents. They require continual editing, updates, and refinements. These works are under development and in discussion. So I want to encourage you, as soon as the link is posted, to comment, respond, give your suggestions, but just know that the format, scope, the exact wording, the examples and resources that are there will change. For our purposes today, though, we're going to keep things to a more general overview. Our time today is a bit tight, and we have additional sessions to sort of deep dive into more specific moments of this safety plan in future sessions. So yeah, just please, once we've run through a little bit of this, provide us with your insights, your wants, your thoughts overall. That's why we're here today. That's why the collaborative doc exists. That's why you have permission to comment on each of these documents. We're kind of coming at this with the idea that equity is a sensibility, it's a perspective, it's a set of learned reactions. And these resources are early steps to develop these skills. Community involvement and feedback, including open talks like these, are necessary to further refine them. So it's also, I guess, important to state that at this point, we cannot set ACM policy. Everything here is a series of recommendations and points for consideration. We can, however, collectively agree on best practices for meaningful inclusion and encourage those around us to stay within them. We can create community accountability. So input from SIGCHI's other committees, other organizations, grassroots groups on these documents is going to be incredibly helpful over the coming months, given the expansive and intersectional nature of equity. So please feel free to keep the links to these documents, to share them with your groups, to think about them and add your thoughts to them as they go on. So I'll post a couple links into the chat here and we can actually get started. Perfect. So everyone can see. Okay, great. So in the chat, I will post actual links instead of just words. This is the collaborative doc that we'll be working off of more today here. I wanted to sort of begin with an overview of what this was trying to do from the very beginning, given, this is going to be a foundational sort of set of programs. And from what we've been hearing from the community at Equity Talks in all of this is that there's a couple different sides to this problem of developing better conference safety. One of those has to do with how events are organized and led, governance structures. One of this has to do with the people who are there and the interactions that we have with fellow attendees, with the community, with guests. And in order to do so, there needs to be accountability in what we're doing. However, we cannot have accountability or equity unless we also have some form of education and programming around making sure that we're closing those gaps in awareness, that we can't really blame someone for coming to a space without being fully aware of its norms. So to create those consistent standards and norms, we need forms of education and training. And that's why I'd like to start out with the Allyship and Bystander Training Program. This is all still visible for folks? Okay, great. So this was originally drafted at CHI 2019, right, Kaylee? By Kaylee and myself and a few other folks that really helped out. We've since expanded it. You'll see some of the content originally from CHI 2019 as placeholders, as we'd like each conference to sort of take up this type of programming as they're able and insert, say, site maps, other relevant local contextual information. So what's covered currently in this allyship training program and bystander intervention program is a lot of terminology that tends to confuse newcomers. This was and long-standing members of the SIGCHI community. We'll have a sort of full organizational map. There are other important abbreviations that have been pain points for many, and begin to dive into, what an ally is. There's aspects of, what those actions look like, what the mentalities look like, observing, listening, directing. And this is sort of a primer to get people thinking about power dynamics. I'm going to move through a bit more of this because we did start this late, but you can see there'll be site maps because we want this type of programming to be modular, hybrid, able to scale up and down. At least we'd like it to be delivered in video format as a learning resource. At best, as most good equity and allyship training happens, it's in person or live so that questions, experiences, all of that can be shared in real time. We have other housekeeping notices. We have some resources that are ACM specific around reporting discrimination and harassment. We've included in this a bit about ACM's discrimination and harassment policy, and that includes sort of what ACM can ensure, guarantee, and be accountable for, and what it cannot. Dive a little bit deeper into what constitutes harassment in its many forms, and things to be keeping in mind as someone who, would take up that mantle of allyship. Of course, there's aspects of bias that we'll be discussing. This is actually the first part that from the community, we'd like to see as much help as humanly possible. We have a nice short moment here on epistemological diversity, but then we dive into these major axes of discrimination and oppression. This is because one of the biggest asks that we've had from equity talks, from feedback on the original pilot launch of that allyship program, was that there's sort of like these clusters, and there needs to be mini training around that. During CHI 2019, there was incredible training of SVs around accessibility. That was because we had experts with lived experience that were present, and within 10 to 15 minutes, we're able to distill a lot of very helpful information. We'd like that to expand beyond accessibility. So we have a sort of cluster of ideas around ableism, body shaming, or body shape bias, attraction bias. We'd like to have a section on colonialism, racism, and xenophobia, a cluster around sexism, homophobia, transphobia, another section around classism, ageism, and elitism. And that will sort of round out the theoretical, the mental, cognitive side of this, a lot of the awareness. But it's a necessary precursor for any bystander intervention, because we need to be able to sort of occupy spaces, walking around and identifying when power dynamics might be harmful. We currently are waiting on one free use copyright, just sort of like going through the boxes to get access and free use for some of this training. And right now we have a meeting planned for next week with some of the writers of what's been a core, the sort of 5Ds here. Right2be.org has some incredible resources that are being used across bystander intervention training, and they seem to be leaning toward allowing us to sort of freely use and modify their materials for this part. So yeah, that's a lot of the bystander intervention training. We have, let me just reload here. Another side. About allyship, actually, if we can take maybe 5-10 minutes to stop listening to me talk. Does anyone have any thoughts, any reflections, any worries about maybe what some of the content is, how we might put together some teams to create shorter modules of training around those clusters of oppression and discrimination that we discussed? And if not, we can move on. Neha?
Yeah, I don't
And
know.
then Navina.
Navina, why don't you go first?
Well, first, this is like really amazing. Like I loved so much of it. I guess one thing could is like at the bottom it says time for Q&A.
Yeah.
Is this meant to like are there other parts throughout where there's like discussion or engagement?
Yeah. Kaylee, did you want to answer that, or I can if you'd like?
Just like opportunities for discussion throughout. I think I don't think there was originally, but I think there should be. We only gave like the pilot version of this training one time, and it was very like, everybody get in this room. We have it for 2 hours. Let's go. But it is also like a big learning opportunity, and I think there needs to be space for people to ask questions, because like it's a relationship that happens in that space with people sharing their experience and their advice. So built-in breaks.
I think that's exactly it. You know, questions come up around, say, like xenophobia. And if we have dedicated teams speaking from those experiences and these things are intersectional, it's like, it's too important and meaningful of an opportunity to pass up being able to actually discuss and dialogue around this, which is why we're not just creating like a YouTube video series. This is why we'd like to see as much hybrid and in-person delivery of this type of program.
Um, this is amazing. I think there's a place where you have 2019. So on the last slide, some email address.
Yeah.
But I think you can imagine where my head would be, which is that do you need space at Kai to have this conversation? And when on what days are you going to be able to get space at Kai from the Kai organizing team, or do you need to use space that the EC has? Because we have some rooms for a few days. I don't think we have them for each day, but I think we have them for some. I don't know what the capacity of these is. So I think Jillian would have information about that actually.
Okay.
Uh, you know, is so just like the logistics of it, I guess, of how to make this happen and who needs to be on board to make this happen. That's one question. Because at the least, what we could do is just have one of our rooms be available for like a workshop or something, and then publicize that on our own channels, even if we have no alignment with Kai, the Kai program, right? And then
That would be
there's
fantastic.
no, that's the least.
I
So
know, as a lowest barrier, yeah.
yeah, and that's just us, right? That's just the EC doing what it needs to do. But ideally, we want this to be really taken up by Kai.
Mhm.
And so what is that going to look like? And I don't know, we can talk about that separately as well. The other, I don't want to be like just thinking about what people are going to complain about, but at the same time, I'm just wondering in terms of adoption, is it going to be hard? I mean, what was your experience with the whole allyship stuff, right? Did you get comments or feedback from people who were simply not willing to be allies? Like, are there such people?
There was fantastic interest. I'll turn it over to Kaylee in one sec. I mean, I think it was in the like 200 plus people had signed up, and we never expected that amount. There was a lot of excitement and camaraderie in the room and afterward throughout the conference around it, which was really invigorating. But you know, I think at least in my experience, and yeah, Kaylee, if you can speak to yours, it really made evident that one of the biggest barriers and problems with safety at conferences is lack of educational like programming around it. I had on 4 different occasions people come up because we had those ally pins ask me, you know, who Ally is and why we're celebrating her. I think that is understandable, especially given like our international community, but like we do need even the most basic of training around this. But Kaylee, did you experience any negative?
I don't think so. Like there was pushback around when the training was held because I think it was like the night before the conference started. So, or anyway, it was before it started. So people were like, well, my flight's not in yet. I can't attend. Like that was just when there was a room available that we could use. And then there was also like the mistake we made that year was the assumption there's accessibility chairs. We don't need to cover accessibility. That foot in mouth, that was not not the move. And so of course, like people from those different groups being like, well, how, like how are you an ally to us? Which is why Kayla's worked so hard to like bring in people who are speaking from their own lived experience to help shape things. Yeah, I don't really know like what else. There's anything else that's really like flashing for me right now.
The only other recurring criticism we had of the pilot launch was that, yeah, if we're offering that training on specific axes of oppression, it does need to be as much as possible live and from those experiences. And I'm taking that really seriously, even though it puts a pretty big weight on this program in terms of organizational time, load, volunteer requests to put that together. But it came up in 4 very separate contexts by 4 very different groups of folks. But Dan, you had your hand up as well.
That's okay. It's sort of it was sort of a separate thing that sort of I thought I was thinking of through there. So I don't want to like completely. I mean, it's somewhat related to something you just said, but I don't want to completely take us in a new direction if there's still other people who have thoughts on some of the stuff that's just been said.
I don't know how related this is, but I'll just mention it anyway, which is that we're trying to do, as of today, also a meal with conference representatives. And I don't know if it's going to end up being a meal or not, but it will be time with conference representatives at CHI. And I think that could be, so even at the events that we do, right, it would help if there's like at least some information, something, a seed that's just planted so that people know that this is happening or that this is something for them to keep in mind, even for the other conferences. So at the conferences, lunch or breakfast or whatever, and add the chapters, maybe there can be like a 5-minute segment or a video that you could do. And we could also take the help of the person who's our photographer in creating that video. But that video could be then like shared, and it can be, shown on screens and things like that to just like inform people. So I'm just thinking about the comms element of this, which I think is really critical, because you said the educational part is the most difficult, right? And yeah, and if you need the help of the CHI team, then that conversation I think would be good to have, like you talking to them about what more could happen. So again, I'm trying to think as much as I can logistics and just how to make this realizable. So Daniel, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I do want to say that this discussion of a meal or not meal event with the leadership sounds really exciting, especially because you said something about like different chapters showing up, which Kayla and I were talking about.
And
like
conferences.
Oh, cool. Because yeah, Kayla and I were talking about last CHI. One of my sort of dream events that I feel should happen at every CHI is like a global town hall with like leadership from different regions and chapters and stuff, which would be so like they in conversation basically so that people can kind of actually the language barrier is difficult for that, right? Like logistically, what I recognize that what I'm suggesting is very difficult, but like the idea of actually putting different sort of regional and disciplinary communities kind of into like explicit dialogue live would be really cool. Anyway, sounds like that might do some of it. Anyway, the thing I was going to say, it goes back to something that Kayla was saying at the end, which is about it sort of adds additional sort of logistical things. But looking through these slides, even though I've looked at these before, something I didn't really think about that actually also speaks to the comment earlier about some of the breaks in there, but also how we sort of make sure that we are highlighting different voices and sort of perspectives in this is actually the kind of the teacher in me actually now sort of, I was kind of always looking at these slides when we've looked at these in the past, I've looked at them sort of just topically, but pedagogically, the fact that this is set up currently to be very broadcast rather than sort of a dialogue with participants, I think is something that we could maybe, again, that sort of increases logistics load, but building in some active learning as buzzy as that is, but like actually building in some kind of like activities that are more collaborative, that makes the training more collaborative with participants, I think would be a valuable addition.
Pedagogically speaking, I want to just add to that, yes, and even if you don't have room to engage people, as in get people to actually ask questions or answer questions, even just having slides that have questions for reflection could be helpful, right? Because at least you're trying to just take a moment and say, okay, think about this for a second, and then we'll come back with more.
Yeah, I agree on all of this. It does need to be interactive. I think that's sort of why we would like to recruit as soon as possible some smaller teams of people that might be able to offer training, advice, education around some of these, so that we can see what kind of content they would like to put into each of those sort of modules, and then we can work toward making it actually like interactive and much more effective than just an info dump.
Do you want to recruit student volunteers just for us to do this? I mean, I don't know if again, we're messing with Kai. We can ask them if they'd be willing to give us some student volunteers. We can recruit some of our own. I think
I-
that could be one way.
I
I
mean,
think so.
I was going to say, I mean, I think even something, speaking of the different teams, right? I think absolutely for it to be successful, especially if we add sort of active, collaborative activities, for lack of a better word, into it, having a team that is not only sort of pedagogically agile and skilled at adapting to situations, but who inherently sort of has a diverse range of perspectives to sort of treat this activity with respect and sort of with that can inform how they engage with it, basically would be useful, especially because like even something as simple as like some kind of note card activity that sort of to Neha's comment about putting up questions to think about, but that actually sort of, even if we don't require them to speak in the room, that we can sort of to collect and sort of anonymously, start to think about not just like these hypotheticals or statistically common discriminations, but we can actually bring the very specific sort of concerns of people in the room who, we can kind of incorporate that into the lesson, and the lesson again, falling into a pedagogical perspective there in a sort of very meaningful way that would sort of ground the activity and the sort of session in a very meaningful way as well. There's a lot of different ways that could happen, but just something as simple as like some kind of note card activity that, shuffle.
So two, I think the only pin I'd like to put in any of this is that so many voices have been present at like the equity talks and protests that have happened throughout different conferences, that if those folks wish to be present to really take reins over each of those modules or sections, I'd like to see them be those people, and then maybe like recruiting student volunteers or other people afterward.
Right.
You might also ask people who are on the organizing committee of Kai who are there. Navina, I wonder if it's possible to encourage some of the GMTA, like when you send out the GMTA notifications, asking them if any of them are available to help with this, right? I mean, just basically putting word out that we need help with this. We need some volunteers. Would you be willing to volunteer?
Awesome. Should I really quickly cover the other two aspects of this? They are shorter than like the allyship program, but just to provide a general sense of what else we're working with. Okay, great. So we noticed that there's been a lot of issues around, I would say, institutional transmission of knowledge and lessons learned. This has left leadership sort of without equity guides. And so many years might go into better accessibility, but gender accessibility ends up in the decline because there's less focus, or, we see a rise in racial profiling, even though childcare and gender accessibility is on the increase, right? And so it's sort of left many general chairs just even feeling like they're drowning because it's hard to capture all of that. And so we've been trying to put together from the equity talks, from other chats with GCs, all these things like this, a chronological checklist or a sort of moment by moment check-in around equity issues that keep rising up. What that sort of begins with is early conference planning. Some of these will need to be fleshed out. Some of these are good on their own, sort of just as a, hey, did you actually remember to do this? Some of these need to be helped out with resources for leadership to self-educate around them. But we've tried to set this into a type of format where, let's say here we have epistemic labor tracking. That is the checkbox. The explanation comes after it, and then there's some useful locally developed guides around that. So we have before, site selection, we have during site, venue, and vendor selection. These include everything from like restroom indications to how you're providing destimulation rooms, prayer rooms. We actually do have guides for a lot of these smaller things. If someone's like, okay, I want this, but we're not sure how to set this up, we can help out with that very easily. Aspects of, lighting, if there is ASL present, often they end up being pushed to the side and are outside of the major lighting and therefore not actually visible. So we've tried to catch as many of these snags as possible before the conference. What networks and organizations to check in with. SIG-Chi Cares is one of them. What does reporting look like? We know that leadership has actually increased ability to act in cases of discrimination and harassment in removing people from conference spaces, but a lot of conference leadership wasn't aware of that. And so that's a problem because we have actually some more accountability than we're using. So it's a huge chunk of what this is also trying to point toward during the conference. And then again, to increase that institutional transmission of knowledge, what should be done after the conference, which involves like what types of community feedback, how are you reporting and disseminating the knowledge that you've gained through that, lists of chairs, what some effective communication of safety supports to attendees can look like. That again is something that's inconsistent through programs. So that's that. And really, really quickly, the last one is sort of a attendee focused bullet point list. So even if you're not interested in allyship, even if we're not allowed to say post a code of conduct and hold people to it, we can at least have some brief information packet where there's these imperatives under self-care for supporting your needs. If you feel overstimulated, having some resources for that, some explanation, what to do in the case of harassment, discrimination, resources, emailing lists. We'll have a flow chart for like who to report to and who has what accountability. So here we have like, if you are contacting the general chairs conference, here are the pros and cons of that. If you contact the equity chairs, here are the pros and cons. If you contact SIG-Chi Cares, the pros and cons again. So we have that. We have sections on community care. We'd like to shorten this as much as possible. We've been talking as an organization about, a wiki and trying to maintain that, and then actually being able to incorporate this as a living document that's growing. And this is sort of, the attendee side of it. So I'll stop talking because my throat is sore and I've been talking at y'all way too much. But with about say 15, 20 minutes left, because we can go over a tiny bit here. Are there any thoughts, other pieces of feedback, other pieces of advice? And if not, and we're just nailing it, that's great. I think we've achieved equity.
What do you think you need help with?
Actually, Navina, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, but we can go ahead with Neha's question first.
Sure. Yeah, in terms of what we need help with, we do not want to develop, like, the idea for a lot of this came from community demand. How to shape it came from community demand. We may have like compiled this, formatted, and put a lot of this together, but we've had really excellent rock stars kind of helping us and holding our hands the whole way through. We want to keep that going. So really, we need the community to keep pitching in on helping us fill this out, helping provide information, identify best resources, best practices. We need more volunteers than we could actually onboard for like the equity committee. And if Kaylee, Dan, Elena, any of you have other thoughts about how we might best be helped right now, like hop in, and then we'll turn it over to Navina.
Sorry, I should go ahead. Or, I guess one thought is, and I know this is like, I guess what hopefully all of this will eventually lead to, but I think in the moment, like when something bad is happening, it's hard to know what to do. And I wonder if we can think also structurally and like physically about the conference space and like what, like, I don't know if you could have like contact info of people in like visible in places, or like QR codes. I don't know if that's like it can like easily oversaturate, but if you can have like easy ways to like get to information. Yeah, I don't know, like stuff like
No,
that.
you totally do know. This is like actually very, very important. We need conferences to be thinking about that. Like we have, say, accessibility specialists or accessibility chairs going to a lot of site visits to ensure that, but often the equity chair is left out of that. Where booths are set up, where information ends up being disseminated. Like I haven't been present at a lot of conference organizing talks, but at the ones that I have been, it's always been like overlooked that is access from here to here really brightly lit so that it's not, like a darker street, like a more unsafe space. So those sensibilities, like we're talking about badges at times, there's a lot of back and forth on that because there's implicit social hierarchy in them as well. But being able to indicate, this is a CARES representative. This is someone who knows bystander intervention. Like this is may not be a safe person, but a safer person. And I think that's going to be part of a larger discussion too, is like, how do we indicate, and do we want to indicate who's been through what programming? Or do we just proceed with hoping that there's more people willing to intervene in moments like that and help other people out with like reporting or, That's really important though. Were there any other thoughts around that, or Neha, did anything come to mind for you right there? Kaylee?
It's something that I see as a continuing challenge is making sure that people like the general chairs are on board. Like since 2019, I have, due to graduating and everything, have not been so involved with stuff, but I still hear things through the grapevine about or I hear them directly, to be frank, about like how, oh God, let's not have a listening post. Like, why do I want to go there and cry for an hour? But it's helpful. But like, I do really appreciate how, in the document, it talks about how to not take these things personally. But different people have different priorities. And so for some people, they might really see the power and the importance of doing all these things. And for other people, it might feel like a drag on top of all the million other things that they're doing. So I don't know if there's an answer necessarily for like how to keep things going and to keep the momentum from year to year. Because after a certain amount of time, I mean, even after a short amount of time, these things become less nice to have, the more things that people expect to see year over year, which is great, but also creates more responsibilities, more things for people to make sure that they aren't falling through the cracks.
I mean, I think if we can build that wiki that Kale mentioned earlier and really build up that institutional sort of resources, I think it helps. I don't think it solves the thing you were just talking about, but I think it really helps to keep that momentum, because you're not, whoever's coming in doesn't have to burn so much energy at the start line again, right?
Mm.
It becomes more of a relay race than it becomes a relay race rather than several back-to-back of the same distant race, right? Like you're not constantly starting and stopping.
Nick,
yeah.
did you want to add something here?
Yeah, I'll put my video on. Hi. Thank you very much, Kale. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I recognise the sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay respects to all the Indigenous people, to their ancestors and to the elders, both past and present. I was just slightly thinking as we went through this fantastic amount of work that you've done, and great things, what way that we can constructively manage the possible risk that this could be seen in certain instances as, let's call it ally washing, a bit like greenwashing, a bit like whitewashing, because there's some of the structures are so deeply embedded in our decision making that this can that aren't compatible with the spirit of these recommendations, and they're slightly out of our hands. Sometimes we're complicit with them, and there's all different reasons. But I am a little bit worried, particularly with the Hawaii conference, that we're going to have a whole long list of wouldn't it be nice to have all of this, and then fundamentally we haven't faced the big elephant in the room, and what we need to do to make sure that we're not accused of ally washing or some other statement.
No, I think that's actually a very important point to bring up. It was something that Kaylee and I also ran into when piloting the allyship program at first. Like you're literally betraying the concept of allyship by pinning ally on someone, and it might be something around maybe the words that we use, the terms that we use, but also how do we not, like, this is a sort of starting point, right? To make sure that there's at least a base level and a base standard, but that can't obscure the fact that there are way larger systemic problems that we as a community have to be tackling. Like that sort of engagement with colonialism. I don't have an answer for you at this point, but I think that's, if someone else does, please jump in. And if someone else doesn't have that answer, then I think it's something that has to be part of the conversation every time we're having these conversations, at least.
I do wonder if maybe ally is fraught as a term now, and that we can't claim to be allies for everyone, but maybe dialing it back to like we're trying to be better members of our community here. I don't have a good name in my head right now, but we're all trying. And like, I am very sensitive to not wanting to come off like, hey, we solved it, or like, look at my badge, I am a great person now. Because that certainly is not the case, and we're gonna mess up. And I think that's like the last thing I want for this too, is to become watered down and just like oh, I get to add another ribbon to my badge, and then not be there for the people who actually need us to be there.
I think Ally also promises more than, to some of these comments, also sometimes promises more than is possible. The word itself sort of suggests, when Kayla's talking about these larger institutional forces, ally is an inherently sort of warfare, like warfare or large scale diplomacy term, and it is, and to say that we are, who are we an ally against? I mean, it sort of suggests some sort of conflict, a level of conflict that is sometimes, to some of these comments, sometimes disingenuous, but also sometimes as genuine as we want to be is maybe a scaling problem. Yeah. I wish I had a more constructive thing. That I personally avoid using it often. I mean, depending on the context that I'm in, I use lots of different words, or I try to avoid them all. I try to focus on what's the activity that is relevant to this sort of support. I belong to a community in the US that sort of helps members of underrepresented communities sort of, it's functionally a leadership program for preparing them for graduate education and research and things like that. And so my label that I have in my head is I'm their parents' golf buddy. Because in the US, right, like there's a trope in movies that you see where, like, you know, privileged people, like they go to their parents because they want to do this thing, and their parent says, oh, well, I've got a golf buddy who's works in that industry, or my old college roommate, right? So my label is an ally. It's parents' college roommate, right? Like imaginary parents' college roommate, because it's replicating or trying to sort of appropriate sort of these invisible networks of privilege. But it is very much about sort of in much the way we're doing, it's countering these sort of institutions from within, which is inherently an imperfect or impossible task to some extent, but certainly not worth abandoning at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's why we want to keep terms like that very tenuous and amenable to change. I do actually have faith that we'll find the right terminology to describe all this accurately. But yeah, we're almost at time. Were there any parting thoughts at this point that anyone wanted to share? Any last bits of wisdom, anecdotes, or memes? Probably don't spam us with memes, but. Awesome. Okay. Oh, Navina.
Nick's land acknowledgement actually reminded me of this. Like, so I guess I remember when I was a grad student, like advice that we got from, Indigenous students on like the meaning of land acknowledgements and how to like, not just have them disappear into the background, is like connecting them to your personal life and like to like the material conditions around you. And I wonder if like part of yeah, like I guess if like the learning process can incorporate some of that, like very much connected to like where the conference is taking place, your specific experiences there. Yeah, sorry, an unformed thought, but
No, again, I think that's a fantastic thought, because yeah, it becomes lip service otherwise. We need it to be tied to action and the immediate material circumstances. So that is why I think there's a bit more of a question around what that looks like and how we can maintain standards and build norms if it's going to be different across, the whole family of Sakai conferences. But if we can find a way to mentor and scaffold and sort of ensure that some of the delivery of that is so very much tied to like the people and the place and the land of the conditions, and like even that conference specifics history with different forms of liberation and oppression, I think that would be like, chef kiss. Yeah.
Sorry, I can't find the hand button. Yes, that's actually made me think of something. So in Australia, you usually have a welcome to country at the beginning of a large meeting, and that's undertaken by an Indigenous person. And I don't know if you actually had that in your guidelines, but that's increasingly for the Pacific and Australia. I have some reservations about what that actually does, other than tokenism, but nonetheless, that's what Indigenous groups actually request. So they see it as a step in the right direction. So even if it just becomes a sort of washing exercise in practice. But maybe that's worthwhile having. So you never really go to a conference in Australia where there isn't acknowledgement.
Yeah, there's a section in the conference leadership guidelines and a larger section in the allyship training where we talk about, how participation in colonialism is happening in different ways and how that needs to be rooted to that event that's taking place, even if it's sort of hybrid. So, it can, but it shouldn't always look like just hiring, Indigenous service providers or Indigenous staff or having something like a land acknowledgement. It's like, how are you directly combating the colonial effects of having that conference in that space? It's not something we can really answer in those guides, but it's resources around that, why that matters, and kind of helps maybe keep that demand and standard present, at least. But I really like where this is going because I think it's very much on track with not making it lip service, not making it just a badge that's worn. Dan's added in the comments, the next comment about Hawaii will definitely be interesting, given the land was taken at gunpoint only 120 years ago, made a state only 60 years ago, and the identity of the people only acknowledged as existing in the census 20 years ago. Yeah, I know here, at least a lot of folks talk about it as, the most recent, newly inaugurated colonialism that's taking place. And it's one that's still stemmable, where many others are very much more entwined and rooted. But yeah, I think we're a little bit past time. I don't want to keep you here all night. Please do reach out if you have further thoughts. Hold on to the links to these documents if you'd like. We'll be having another session on Tuesday where the Equity Committee will present essentially the same materials, but fresh faces. It'll be a nice little Valentine's gift to everyone. And hopefully you can stay in dialogue with us about all of this. But thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all.